The day I was hospitalized for emergency treatment, my parents claimed they were too busy with work to come, yet that very evening, my grandfather suddenly appeared at the door of my hospital room. Chapter 1: The Old Man at the Ward Door. When I was wheeled into the emergency resuscitation room, my parents said they were too busy with work to make it. But that very evening, my grandfather, with whom I hadn't been in contact for 6 years, stood at the door of my hospital room, leaning on a cane. And the very first thing he said was, "Child, have you finally seen them for what they truly are?" The hospital room was quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic 星号, beep 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 星号of the vital signs monitor. I lay on the hospital bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. The anesthesia hadn't fully worn off yet. My abdomen felt as though someone were scraping back and forth across it with a dull knife. With every breath I took, the pain tightened its grip. The doctor had said, had I been brought in just 2 hours later, the gastric perforation would have led to an infection, and my life would have been in grave danger. But the most absurd part of it all was this. From the moment I was wheeled into the ER until the surgery was complete, a span of 8 whole hours, there wasn't a single message from my parents on my phone. I closed my eyes. The memory of that phone call from earlier that afternoon rang in my ears once more. "Dad, I'm about to be taken into the operating room." Silence hung on the other end of the line for 2 seconds. Then, my father, Lin Jiangwo, spoke. "Is it that serious? The doctor says I need surgery immediately." "Oh." He sounded as though he were in the middle of a meeting. I could even hear the clicking of a keyboard in the background. "Well, go ahead and get it done then." I froze for a moment. "Aren't you coming?" Silence fell on the other end once again. Then came his reply. "Wan Qing, we have an important client at the company today. I really can't get away." Before I could say another word, my mother, Zhou Meiling, suddenly chimed in from the background. "Isn't Jihao signing the contract to buy his apartment tomorrow? We still have to go over the bank loan documents with him today. You're a grown woman in your 30s, it's just a simple surgery, stop being so dramatic." 星号 click 星号. The call ended. In that moment, I didn't even have the presence of mind to feel sad. I simply felt a profound sense of absurdity. It felt as though someone had gouged a hole right through my chest. Yet I didn't even have the time to register the pain. The door to the hospital room creaked open. A nurse walked in to change my dressing. "Miss Lin, how are you feeling?" "I'm all right." The nurse glanced at me. She looked as if she wanted to say something, but hesitated. Finally, she couldn't help but ask, "Was the gentleman who brought you in this afternoon your husband?" I shook my head. "I'm not married." The nurse looked taken aback for a moment. "Then was he a friend who came with you?" I shook my head again. "He's a colleague." The nurse's expression suddenly grew somewhat complex. The person who had rushed me to the hospital this afternoon was a young woman from my company's administrative department. She was 23 years old. She had graduated just a year ago. Usually, she liked to wander around her cubicle clutching a cup of bubble tea. But today, she had been so terrified that she wept the entire way here. When the doctor asked for signatures, her hands were trembling. In the end, it was she who handled all the hospital procedures for me, running up and down the corridors. And she didn't leave until the surgery was over. As for my parents, they never showed up, from start to finish. The nurse said softly, "That young colleague of yours is really a good person." "Ma'am." I smiled. "She really is." After the nurse left, the hospital room fell silent once more. Outside the window, the sky gradually darkened. The city lights began to twinkle, resembling a shimmering, nebulous sea of stars. Suddenly, I was reminded of my childhood. I was 8 years old at the time. I had a raging fever 40 degrees. I lay in bed, drifting in and out of consciousness from the heat. Yet my parents were away, accompanying my younger brother to a piano competition. It was our nanny who carried me to the hospital. I spent 3 whole hours hooked up to an LC drip. When we returned home in the middle of the night, my parents still hadn't come back. The next day, my mother simply placed her hand on my forehead, then said, "It's good that the fever has gone down." It was treated as casually as a change in yesterday's weather. Utterly inconsequential. Back then, I didn't understand. I always felt that I wasn't good enough. That I wasn't mature enough. That I wasn't worthy of being loved. So I strove relentlessly. I topped my class. I won scholarships. I landed a job at a prestigious company. I earned a promotion to a management position. I believed that, as long as I was good enough, my parents would, one day, finally spare me a second glance. But today, lying here in this hospital bed, I suddenly realized something. When some people don't love you, it isn't because you aren't good enough. It is simply because they were never prepared to love you in the first place. It was a little past 9 o'clock that night. Footsteps echoed from outside the ward. Slow. Heavy. It sounded as if someone were dragging something along. I assumed it was the doctor making rounds. I paid it no mind. Until the ward door was pushed open. Instinctively, I turned my head. The very next second, I froze completely. Standing in the doorway was an old man. His hair was entirely white. He wore a faded, gray jacket that had been washed threadbare. In his right hand, he leaned on a walking stick. His back was slightly hunched. Yet he stood remarkably steady. That face etched with wrinkles. I hadn't seen it in 6 years. Grandpa. Lin Yuanshan. For a fleeting moment, I thought my eyes were deceiving me. Gee, Grandpa. The old man looked at me. His eyes suddenly welled up with red. He parted his lips, as if he had 1,000 things he wanted to say. But in the end, only one sentence escaped him. You've grown so thin. My nose stung instantly. 6 years. A full 6 years. First since my father and grandfather had a falling out. I hadn't seen him once. I'd heard he had moved back to our ancestral home. To grow vegetables. And raise chickens. Refusing to have anything to do with anyone. My father had even forbidden the family from ever mentioning his name. As if the man had never existed at all. But now. Here he stood, right at the doorway of my hospital room. Stepping inside, one slow pace at a time. Grandpa, what brings you here? The old man offered no reply. He simply placed the thermos he was carrying onto the table. Then sat down. He studied me closely, meticulously. His gaze seeming to search for, or confirm, something specific. After a long silence, he let out a sigh. Child. Has it been hard? I froze. I didn't know why. I hadn't cried when they wheeled me into the operating room earlier that day. I hadn't cried when my parents turned me away. But now, in this moment, I suddenly couldn't hold it back. My tears came tumbling down. I lowered my head. Afraid to look at him. Afraid he would see just how wretched I looked. The old man offered no words of persuasion. Nor any words of comfort. He simply sat there in silence. Waiting for me to finish crying. That was always his way. When I was little and took a tumble, everyone else would rush to help me up. Only Grandpa would squat down beside me, waiting for me to get back on my feet all by myself. And then, he would simply pat me on the shoulder. He told me, in this life, relying on anyone else is never as good as relying on yourself. A long silence fell over the hospital room. Finally, I wiped away my tears. I looked up and asked, how did you know I was hospitalized? The old man gave a cold snort. Did you really think I was dead? I was stunned. He pulled an old-fashioned mobile phone, the kind designed for the elderly, from his pocket. The screen bore a hairline crack. It looked as though it had been used for many years. Old Lou, the security guard downstairs at your company, is a former apprentice of mine. And there's a nurse down in the ER, she's the granddaughter of an old comrade in arms. I know exactly what time you go to work and what time you get off. I know it even better than your own parents do. I stared at him blankly. Suddenly, I didn't know what to say. So, all these past 6 years. It wasn't that I couldn't find Grandpa. It was that he had been watching over me from a distance the entire time. The old man gazed out the window. His voice grew low and heavy. I used to think, no matter how biased they were, surely they wouldn't go 星号 this 星号 far. But today, when I heard you were being wheeled into surgery, they didn't even bother showing up at the hospital. That was when I realized. He paused. He tightened his grip on his walking stick. His knuckles turned faintly white. I had given them far too much credit. Silence fell over the room once again. For the first time, I noticed. Grandpa seemed to have aged so much. The man who once could hoist 2 sacks of rice onto his shoulders and climb 6 flights of stairs now needed a walking stick just to stand up. And yet, despite all that, he had still rushed all the way here from hundreds of kilometers away. Meanwhile, my own parents couldn't even be bothered to make a single phone call. Suddenly, the old man reached inside his jacket and pulled out a yellowed, old notebook. He placed it gently on the bedside table. I glanced at it. The cover was worn and frayed. The corners were yellowed with age. It looked as though it had been kept for many, many years. "What is this?" I asked. The old man remained silent for a few seconds. Then, slowly, he spoke. "There are some things. I had intended to take them with me to my grave. But now, it seems, I can no longer keep them hidden." My heart gave a sudden, violent lurch. The old man looked at me. Within those eyes clouded with age, yet still sharp and piercing, lay an emotion I could not quite decipher. It looked like guilt. It looked like heartache. It felt, too, like a resolve that had been years in the making. He pushed the notebook forward slightly. His voice was soft. Yet it seemed to freeze the very air throughout the entire hospital room. "Wanqing, do you know why your father insisted on severing ties with me all those years ago?" I froze. The very next second, the old man slowly opened the yellow diary. And the contents of the first page made my breath catch in my throat. For written there was a name. My name,